Salawat. We'll inshallah start the program with the recitation of Surah Yasin from Fatima Mcgee.
غافلون لقد حق القول على أكثرهم فهم لا يؤمنون إنا جعلنا في أعناقهم أغلالا فهي إلى الأذقان فهم مقمحون وجعلنا من بين أيديهم سدا ومن خلفهم سدا فأغشيناهم فهم لا يبصرون وسواء عليهم أأنذرتهم أم لم تنذرهم لا يؤمنون إنما تنذر من اتبع الذكر وخشي الرحمن بالغيب فبشره بمغفرة وأجر كريم إنا نحن نحيي الموتى ونكتب ما قدموا وآثارهم وكل شيء أحصيناه في إمام مبين واضرب لهم مثلا أصحاب القرية إذ جاءها المرسلون إذ أرسلنا إليهم 2 فكذبوهما فعززنا بثالث فقالوا إنا إليكم مرسلون قالوا ما أنتم إلا بشر مثلنا وما أنزل الرحمن من شيء إن أنتم إلا تكذبون قالوا ربنا يعلم إنا إليكم لمرسلون وما علينا إلا البلاغ المبين قالوا إنا تطيرنا بكم لئن لم تنتهوا لنرجمنكم وليمسنكم منا عذاب أليم قالوا طائركم معكم أئن ذكرتم بل أنتم قوم مسرفون وجاء من أقصى المدينة رجل يسعى قال يا قوم اتبعوا المرسلين اتبعوا من لا يسألكم أجرا وهم مهتدون وما لي لا أعبد الذي فطرني وإليه ترجعون أأتخذ من دونه آلهة إن يردني الرحمن بضر لا تغني عني شفاعتهم شيئا ولا ينقذون إني إذا لفي ضلال مبين إني آمنت بربكم فاسمعون قيل ادخل الجنة قال يا ليت قومي يعلمون بما غفر لي ربي وجعلني من المكرمين وما أنزلنا على قومه من بعده من جند من السماء وما كنا منزلين إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم خامدون يا حسرة على العباد ما يأتيهم من رسول إلا كانوا به يستهزئون ألم يروا كم أهلكنا قبلهم من القرون أنهم إليهم لا يرجعون وإن كل لما جميع لدينا محضرون وآية لهم الأرض الميتة أحييناها وأخرجنا منها حبا فمنه يأكلون وجعلنا فيها جنات من نخيل وعناب وفجرنا فيها من العيون ليأكلوا من ثمره وما عملته أيديهم أفلا يشكرون سبحان الذي خلق الأزواج كلها مما تنبت الأرض ومن أنفسهم ومما لا يعلمون وآية لهم الليل نسلخ منه النهار فإذا هم مظلمون والشمس تجري لمستقر لها ذلك تقدير العزيز العليم والقمر قدرناه منازل حتى عاد كالعرجون القديم لا الشمس ينبغي لها أن تدرك القمر ولا الليل سابق النهار وكل في فلك يسبحون وآية لهم أنا حملنا ذريتهم في الفلك المشحون وخلقنا لهم من مثله ما يركبون وإن نشأ نغرقهم فلا صريخ لهم ولا هم ينقذون إلا رحمة منا ومتاعا إلى حين وإذا قيل لهم اتقوا ما بين أيديكم وما خلفكم لعلكم ترحمون وما تأتيهم من آية من آيات ربهم إلا كانوا عنها معرضين وإذا قيل لهم أنفقوا مما رزقكم الله قال الذين كفروا للذين آمنوا أنطعم من لو يشاء الله أطعمه إن أنتم إلا في ضلال مبين ويقولون متى هذا الوعد إن كنتم صادقين ما ينظرون إلا صيحة واحدة تأخذهم وهم يخصمون فلا يستطيعون توصية ولا إلى أهلهم يرجعون ونفخ في الصور فإذا هم من الأجداث إلى ربهم ينسلون قالوا يا ويلنا من بعثنا من مرقدنا هذا ما وعد الرحمن وصدق المرسلون إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم جميع لدينا محضرون فاليوم لا تظلم نفس شيئا ولا تجزون إلا ما كنتم تعملون إن أصحاب الجنة اليوم في شغل فاكهون هم وأزواجهم في ظلال على الأرائك متكئون لهم فيها فاكهة ولهم ما يدعون سلام قولا من رب رحيم وامتازوا اليوم أيها المجرمون ألم أعهد إليكم يا بني آدم ألا تعبدوا الشيطان إنه لكم عدو مبين وأن اعبدوني هذا صراط مستقيم ولقد أضل منكم جبلا كثيرا أفلم تكونوا تعقلون هذه جهنم التي كنتم توعدون اصلوها اليوم بما كنتم تكفرون اليوم نختم على أفواههم وتكلمنا أيديهم وتشهد أرجلهم بما كانوا يكسبون ولو نشاء لطمسنا على أعينهم فاستبقوا الصراط فأنى يبصرون ولو نشاء لمسخناهم على مكانتهم فما استطاعوا مضيا ولا يرجعون ومن نعمره ننكسه في الخلق أفلا يعقلون وما علمناه الشعر وما ينبغي له إن هو إلا ذكر وقرآن مبين لينذر من كان حيا ويحق القول على الكافرين أولم يروا أنا خلقنا لهم مما عملت أيدينا مما عملت أيدينا أنعاما فهم لها مالكون وذللناها لهم فمنها ركوبهم ومنها يأكلون ولهم فيها منافع ومشارب أفلا يشكرون واتخذوا من دون الله آلهة لعلهم ينصرون لا يستطيعون نصرهم وهم لهم جند محضرون فلا يحزنك قولهم إنا نعلم ما يسرون وما يعلنون أولم ير الإنسان أنا خلقناه من نطفة فإذا هو خصيم مبين وضرب لنا مثلا ونسي خلقه قال من يحيي العظام وهي رميم قل يحييها الذي أنشأها أول مرة وهو بكل خلق عليم الذي جعل لكم من الشجر الأخضر نارا فإذا أنتم منه توقدون أوليس الذي خلق السماوات والأرض بقادر على أن يخلق مثلهم بلى وهو الخلاق العليم إنما أمره إذا أراد شيئا أن يقول له كن فيكون فسبحان الذي بيده ملكوت كل شيء وإليه ترجعون. الفاتحة.
Sisters and brothers, we've been requested to recite a Surah Fatiha for Marhum Hussein Ali Nazrali Rajwani, who was the father of Sister Mansoura Mukhtar Mcgee and Brother Shani Abbas Rajwani, who passed away earlier today in Dar es Salaam. So can we recite a Surah Fatiha for him and for all Marhumin, please? We'll now continue the program with the recitation of Qur'an from Nabila Vasi. Can we welcome her with a salawat?
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم فلما سمعت بمكرهن أرسلت إليهن وأعتدت لهن متكأ وآتت كل واحدة منهن سكينا وقالت تخرج عليهن فلما رأيناه أكبرنه وقطعنا أيديهن وقلنا هذا لله ما هذا بشرا إن هذا إلا ملك كريم قالت فذلكن الذي لمتنني فيه ولقد راودته عن نفسه فاستعصم ولئن لم يفعل ما آمره ليسجنن ولا يكون من الصاغرين قال ربي سجن أحب إلي مما يدعونني إليه وإلا تصرف عني كيدهن أسم إليهن وأكون من الجاهلين فاستجاب له ربه فصرف عنه كيدهن إنه هو السميع العليم ثم بدا لهم من بعد ما رأوا الآيات ليسجننه حتى حين صدق الله العلي العظيم.
And then you will carry on. Perfect.
It'll go on the screen as well.
Okay, so just when it's done.
It will happen straight away.
Oh, great.
Now we're very fortunate to have Dr. Maria Norris, who will be speaking to us on reflections on 20 years of the war on terror. Dr. Maria Norris is currently a research fellow on the ERC-funded project Neoliberal Terror, the Radicalisation of Social Policy in Europe. She works primarily on the qualitative research package, investigating the genealogy of CVE policy and discourse in Europe. Her main interest in research is the dialectic relationship between national identity and national security, and she's particularly interested in how terrorism and extremism are constructed in policy. And you can find her on Twitter at Maria W. Norris.
Yes, is that all right? Yeah. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Yeah. Thank Yeah, it's okay here. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, good. Hi. Thank you. First of all, yes, I'm Maria. Nice to meet you. I wanted to say that I'm very grateful and honored to be here today. It's really a pleasure. And the first thing that it made me think of many things, but it made me think of the saying that we have in Christianity where one or more of you are together, I will be there as well. So having the opportunity to be amongst people and amongst prayer, especially after this year of pandemic where we've been so isolated, is really a pleasure. So thank you so much for that. What I wanted to talk about today, reflections on 20 years of the war on terror. That sounds quite heavy. And it is a heavy topic, but the way that I understand the world, the way that we understand the world as human beings is through stories. We connect to each other through stories. We learn about the world through stories. We learn about our religion through stories. I remember spending many, many hours with my friends when I was at university in the women's prayer room, and they taught me through stories about Islam, and I taught them about Christianity through the stories that I was taught by my parents and grandparents growing up. So that's how we understand each other, and that's how we understand the world around us. So when I talk about, oh good, it works, great. I love when technology works, there's not always a guarantee. So when I talk about storytelling, we as a species are storytellers. We understand each other through stories, and we understand the world that we live in through stories. So if you want to use an academic term to it, is what we call in academia looking at the world as a social construction, which means that we construct the world around us, we give it meaning, we give it purpose with the words that we give to the things around us. So let me read this quote because it's one that I think really exemplifies what I'm talking about. To raise the question of the nature of narrative is to invite reflection on the very nature of culture and even on the nature of humanity itself. So when I talk about the world being a social construction, what I mean is that there are certain things that are laws of nature, like gravity, for example, but there are certain things like policy, society, going to school, voting, governments, etc. Those things are constructed by us, are constructed by individuals, and their existence depends on the stories that we tell about what is the state, what is the individual, what is the role of the state and the role of the individual. So when I talk about the world being a social construction, I talk about the role that we play as human beings, telling each other stories about the world that we live in and what the world that we live in should be, for example. So I always start my classes with my students at university using this picture of Nelson Mandela. And we tend to think, or at least I do in my research, I look at terrorism as a social construction. So what I mean by that is that terrorism doesn't exist unless you call it terrorism. So the saying is, the quote here is that terrorism is just a label. It's a category that social actors use to make sense of an event. So if any action of violence were to happen, it would only be considered an act of terror if somebody called it that. It is a label. It is a story about violence, usually violence that is considered illegitimate in some way. And with that, I have always the question as well, what violence is legitimate then? You know, why is one violence legitimate and was one illegitimate, and how does one decide? And it means that it's essentially a normative concept. That means that it's very controversial and that there isn't a single accepted definition of what it is. And the example that I always give to my students is of Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1993, but he was in the US terrorist list until 2008. So it's really representative of this idea of terrorism being a label that is attached to an action or a person for a particular reason. And in my research over the last decade, over a decade now, I've spent a lot of my time looking at this construction. That is my main research interest, and my main interest as an academic, as a person in this area, is how is this construction of terrorism being constructed? Where does it come from? How is it being deployed? Against whom is it being deployed? And what are the consequences of this? And essentially, this is a story about what violence is legitimate and what violence is legitimate, and what are the consequences for society. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about law. I'm not a lawyer, thank God. I married one, but I'm not one. And I find law very dry and less fun than policy, because law is written, it's there, you deal with it. And I don't find that as interesting. But the Terrorism Act 2000 has the legal definition of terrorism that the UK uses. And at first, this is really fascinating to me just by the fact that they've tried to codify into law something which is essentially uncodifiable. So it's problematic to begin with. And up until 2000, the UK didn't have a codified legal definition of terrorism. The UK didn't even have a permanent piece of terrorism legislation until 2000. Previously, it was a series of emergency legislation measures that were subject to debate in Parliament. But in 2000, we had the Terrorism Act 2000, which became the first of now more than 2,000 pieces of legislation dealing with terrorism in the UK. And they tried their best to define what terrorism is in law. So I'm not going to go through all of it with you, but I wanted to highlight two sections. So we tend to think of terrorism, if you ask somebody on the street or something, what is terrorism? They'll say it's political violence. It's violence which is political. And for me, my first retort to that is always, well, what violence isn't political? Every violence is political. It says, oh, but it's violence for a cause. Yeah, but isn't every individual act of violence for a cause as well, even if it's an individual cause? So how is one a crime? When is one act of violence murder versus when an act of violence, the same act of violence is an act of terror? How are we defining this? Which murder is political and which murder isn't political? And if you look at the Terrorism Act 2000, especially in subsection, where is it? There, 1C here. The violence doesn't have to be political. It is violence, the use or threat of violence, made for the purpose of advancing a political, religious, racial, or ideological cause. It doesn't have to be about politics. It can be about ideology, it can be about race, it can be about religion. All of those things for me are political, but let's, for the sake of argument here, make it the sense that it doesn't necessarily have to be political the way that we understand it to be. And it's also, if you look at subsection 4, the action can be in the United Kingdom, outside the United Kingdom, against the United Kingdom, against anybody else that the United Kingdom seems to be friendly or unfriendly with at the time. So what I wanted to illustrate by showing the full definition of terrorism, the Terrorism Act 2000, is that it's extremely broad. The former independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, David Anderson, he's retired now and somebody else is in his place, he once gave evidence for an all-parliamentary committee on human rights, and he was asked which one was the biggest threat of counterterrorism legislation to human rights in the United Kingdom. And he identified the definition of terrorism in the Terrorism Act 2000 because it is so broad, because it can be applied against anyone and anything. It is extremely broad. And I agree with him. But where I disagree with him is that the problem is not only that it's broad, but that in practice it's applied in a very selective way. It is broad, it could be applied to anything, but it isn't. So that was what I did my PhD on many, many years ago now. is this question of what is behind the selective application of the terrorism label. What explains the story of terrorism that we're told here in the United Kingdom? So let's see. Oh, it's not moving forward. Ah, there we go. So, to illustrate this, you can't see because my face is in the way, but the picture is of a man called Lee Rigby. He was murdered in 2013 by two individuals. Oh, you can see that, great. He was murdered by two individuals in 2013 who were screaming extremist rhetoric as they killed him. That murder was immediately considered to be an act of terror. The government at the time, headed by David Cameron, summoned a COBRA meeting, the emergency COBRA meeting to deal with it, and they launched a new strategy to counter extremism as a result of it. A few days after Lee Rigby was murdered, Mohammed Salim was murdered in the Midlands. He was murdered by a far-right extremist, a neo-Nazi. The government was silent on it. There was no COBRA meeting convened. There was no strategy to counter neo-Nazism or to understand far-right extremism. Fast forward to 2016, the MP Joe Cox was murdered on the eve of the Brexit vote by a man yelling Britain first, who had clear links to neo-Nazi groups in the United States and in Europe, and yet he was not considered a terrorist. He was considered a terrorist in law. He was tried as a terrorist, but in policy, he wasn't considered a terrorist. And what I mean by that is that the government remained silent. They didn't launch any kind of inquiry. They didn't launch any kind of strategy or policy or inquiry to find out the roots of far-right extremism. It was treated as an anomaly. It was treated as a one-off. But we know, at least those of us that work in this field, know that violence from the far right, from neo-Nazi groups, is on the rise in the United Kingdom. It is perhaps the biggest threat to our national security, but it's something that is not being dealt with. And the reason it's not being dealt with is because the policy of counterterrorism, because law is one thing, law is very dry. Policy is what animates law, is what gives it purpose, and is what gives it reason. And policies are another form of storytelling. So I look at policies as a narrative, as stories. So Roe defines policies as stories which underwrite and stabilize the assumption for policymaking in situations that persist with many unknowns. So what that means is that social problems are complicated. Inequality, drink driving, etc. These are social problems that are very complex. So policies and policy narratives and stories come in place to create a coherent narrative, explaining what the problem is, attaching blame, and then proposing a solution. And we can see they're very good examples of very successful policy narratives. The first one that comes to mind is seatbelts. It wasn't until, I believe, the 80s or something that seatbelts were mandatory. There had to be a whole public education campaign and a policy to make seatbelts mandatory, to make people wear seatbelts because it was for their safety. That was a very successful policy narrative. Similarly, you can think about all the policies in place to discourage people from smoking, forbidding smoking inside places and all the pictures on the packages. That's also a very successful policy narrative, telling the public a story about a complex issue and trying to explain it to them, assigning blame and proposing a solution. One example of a policy narrative that wasn't very successful is David Cameron's The Big Society. I don't know if anyone remembers this, but when David Cameron was Prime Minister many years ago, his big policy was the big society, about Britain coming together and whatever it was. I don't know what the big society was, and I've researched it because there wasn't a clear story of what it was, what the problem was that it was trying to address, and what the solution was. So policies rely on coherent stories in order for them to be successful. So when we're talking about counterterrorism, it's important that we look beyond the law and we look at the policy that is underpinning the law, that is creating this story of what terrorism is and what it isn't. And the UK counterterrorism strategy has a flagship policy. I'm sure all of us here have heard of the PREVENT program, and we'll get to the PREVENT program, but the PREVENT program is a part of the larger policy called CONTEST. And CONTEST is not talked about as much as the PREVENT program, but CONTEST is just as problematic, if not more, because it's where the root of PREVENT is. So what CONTEST does, it was started in 2003, it was first available to the public in 2006, and then it became this huge flagship policy in 2009 that's been maintained over the years as the core of UK counterterrorism policy. And what Contest does, and it does it very successfully, is it creates a story of terrorism. It creates a policy narrative of what terrorism is. It assigns blame and it proposes a solution. It explains the problem, assigns blame, and proposes a solution. Now, when I say it does it successfully, it doesn't mean I agree with it. In fact, I think it's horrendous, but it works. And that's why it's successful. And the way that the story is created, the way that I tell it is that the UK government, through policy, has defined terrorism as a foreign problem, as a problem of the other, as a problem that comes from abroad. It's located abroad in an ideology that is foreign, with people that were born abroad or have relationships abroad and then came here in the diaspora, etc. And that's where terrorism comes from. It is a deeply racial and discriminatory policy. And the way that they've created this story, if you'd like, you can read my PhD on this. It's nearly 100,000 pages long, and it's available somewhere in the library. My parents have a copy. But to get to the nitty-gritty of it, just a couple of examples. The story is constructed through a process of assimilation and disassociation. And the assimilation is that through hundreds of paragraphs, what the government policy does is it creates a history of terrorism that starts in the Middle East with the Intifada in 1987, and with political Islam, as they call it then. That's when it started. And it creates this unbroken narrative that goes, it's really absurd. It goes from the Intifada to the Algerian Civil War, to the conflict in Chechnya, to Lebanon and Hezbollah. It just is everything. Is anything that is vaguely, where Islam is vaguely political in any way, it gets assimilated into the story of terror, that's where the threat comes from. That's where the assignation of blame comes from. That's where the root of the problem is. And it does this through, like I said, hundreds of paragraphs telling the story. It is very successful in doing that. It's very well researched. It is very wrong and discriminatory, but it is presented in a very convincing way. And the other arm of the story, as it were, is this process of disassociation. So every story has actors. There's lots of people in a story, right? In the story of terror proposed by the UK government in the Contest policy papers, the only people that are active actors are Islam as an ideology, not the religion, as the ideology, and Muslims. The UK government, the West, not present in the story in any way. They're completely removed and disassociated from the story in very significant ways. So this is one example. So this is the only paragraph that talks about Guantanamo Bay in the hundreds of pages of this. The treatment of detainees in Guantanamo Bay is widely felt to demonstrate the UK government's lack of commitment to human rights. Those are conditional languages. That's conditional language. The treatment of individuals in Guantanamo Bay, rather than the torture of individuals in Guantanamo Bay, is widely felt to demonstrate a lack of commitment of human rights, rather than demonstrates a lack of commitment to human rights. It is very detailed. It's like as if I'm, picking things, being very picky, but that's what narratives are. That's what languages you need to get picky with these things, because these things matter. And this is not just an individual case. This happens throughout the policy. The Iraq War is mentioned twice, and it says the Iraq War happened, and that's it. It doesn't say why. It doesn't say what role the UK played. It doesn't say about anything that UK forces did in the Iraq War. It just happened. It's in a vacuum. So what this does, it completely removes the United Kingdom and the West, the United States, from any narrative of terror. It is presented in isolation. There is no geopolitical context. There is no historical context. There is no context at all. The only context actually that it's given is the ideology and the history of Islam as presented in the policy, which is bad and very problematic, because it doesn't stay by itself. The policy developed into something bigger, which we now know as the PREVENT program. The PREVENT program actually started in 2003, but became really big in 2009. Up until 2011, PREVENT money, so money from the central government, to be distributed in the fight against terror was distributed on the basis of demographics. Any local authority in the United Kingdom that had a minimum of 5% Muslims living in the area automatically received counterterrorism money. And at the time, this was around 2010, I submitted multiple Freedom of Information requests to all the local authorities that were listed as priority areas in the government website. And I received all of them back, and several, I remember one from Wandsworth and Lambeth, for example, had produced very detailed risk assessment reports which said, we've done a risk assessment in our local area. There is no risk of extremism here. But we received the money, so we'll use it anyway, because they received the money based on demographics. So what they did is that they used that money into things like youth groups, football groups, theater groups for children after school, for example. That was all funneled through and funded through counterterrorism money. And that is problematic, because in one way, councils are starved for funds, so of course they will take it and they will use it for something which in the face value of it is great. Youth groups, football groups, theater groups, etc. Any kind of youth engagement is starved for money and they need it. However, what you have there is the state interacting with the group, the Muslim population, through the prism of security and through the prism of threat. It's not coming through the prism of community engagement, of let's all get together in a big society, whatever. It's coming through the prism of security, and that is very problematic. In 2011, the demographic priority was supposedly changed. I say supposedly because the government made a big deal in the review of PREVENT in 2011 to declare that they were no longer going to distribute PREVENT money through demographics because they accepted that it could be viewed as discriminatory. Again, the language could be viewed as discriminatory rather than, yeah, it was discriminatory and Islamophobic and quite racist as well. But all the local priority areas, the local authority areas that were listed as priority PREVENT areas were the same. And I remember at the time I submitted multiple Freedom of Information requests to the government asking for the rationale for the priority areas now. And they were all refused because they said that to release this information would be aiding and abetting terrorism. Because of course they can say that and not release information. So it is unclear what the priority areas are at the moment and why they are decided as priority areas. They haven't made that clear. And then in 2015, we had the PREVENT duty, which is also linked to the work that I do at the University of Warwick when we talk about the radicalization of social care. And this is happening all over Europe as well, not just in the United Kingdom. The PREVENT duty was established in the Counterterrorism and Security Act of 2015, and it demanded, it places statutory duty on schools, doctors, social workers, etc., to prevent people from becoming terrorists. So what that means in practice is that they have to be aware and watch for signs that those people might become terrorists. It is presented as a safeguarding issue, as a way of protecting vulnerable people. But in reality, it isn't, because it changes the relationship between people who are supposed to look after you, like a doctor or a teacher, into somebody that's looking at you for signs that you could be a national security threat. It changes the relationship between the individual and the state, and the individual and those who are supposed to be safeguarding them. So it is very problematic. And it is ridiculous in many levels, but one of the ways that it's very ridiculous is that it places a statutory duty on teachers, including primary school teachers, including nurseries, key workers, to prevent terrorism. So my daughter is nearly 4, and her nursery has a page on it when they talk about the training that they've done for prevent and counterterrorism. It's like, they're 4. I mean, have you met a 4-year-old or a 3-year-old? My daughter is clearly insane and an extremist in many ways, but that's just what kids are like. How are you supposed to spot a sign of an extremist in a 4-year-old? So I put this picture there as an example, because this is quite a famous example of the prevent duty gone awry. So this was a picture done by a 4-year-old at nursery, and when the teacher asked them, "What is this that you've drawn?" the kid said, "Oh, it's a cooker bump." And the teacher then reported the child to the counterterrorism authorities and their family, when in fact it was a cucumber. The kid mispronounced cucumber, the 4-year-old mispronounced cucumber. So based on that picture, a family was put through the process of having the counterterrorism de-radicalization program. They didn't go through it because obviously it was stopped at one point, saying of course this is absurd, But it is quite stressful to have gone through it and been referred to it in the first place. It should never have happened. And this only happens because of this narrative of terrorism, of the story of terrorism that places a community, the Muslim community in the UK, as the source of the problem, as the source of the threat. And it changes the relationship between the state and that community because they become adversaries. They become suspects in a possible war or conflict. And I always use this quote as an example, because really that is the quote that launched 1,000 ships, the quote that launched 1,000 dissertations, my dissertation as it were, and it's the reason why I'm here today and why I have a career in the first place. It was 2009 when the counterterrorism strategy, Contest and Prevent, were released, and I don't really remember why I decided to read it. But I'm weird, so I probably was bored, and decided to read it. And at one point in the Prevent section of the strategy, there's this quote: "We want to make it harder for violent extremists to operate in our country and to win support for their activities and ideologies. But we also need to make clear what kind of country we want for ourselves." And that gave me pause, because that is the language of nation building. That is the language of nationalism. And what is it doing in a national security policy? So then what you have is national security being used as a tool of nation building, as a way of controlling membership, of controlling belonging in the United Kingdom. So you have, in many ways, counterterrorism acting as a form of border control, and border control acting as a form of counterterrorism. It is a symbiotic relationship. I have a podcast called Enemies of the People. And in the latest episode, I spoke with a scholar called Maya Goodfellow. She wrote a book called Hostile Environment: How Immigrants Became Scapegoats. And we talked about her book. And she talks in her book about how the hostile environment has turned doctors, teachers, etc. into border guards. And I talked about how the counterterrorism strategy, especially the prevent duty, has turned doctors and teachers into border guards, but also counterterrorism officers. And what does that mean for the health of society and the health of Britain as a nation, if this kind of nation building is happening in this way, in this very discriminatory way, and in a way that really does not make anyone safe? So what about the far right? My work in the last few years has been really focused on the far right in the United Kingdom, looking at white nationalist groups, far right groups, incel violence, etc. The far right is technically part of the UK counterterrorism strategy, but not really, because it became officially part of the counterterrorism strategy in the Prevent Review in 2011. But all you have is a couple of paragraphs saying, oh yeah, it's part, we're dealing with it as well. There isn't a single paragraph, and there was another review published in 2018, which is the latest version of the counterterrorism strategy. There isn't a single paragraph defining what far-right extremism is. There isn't a single paragraph explaining far-right extremism, saying where it comes from, saying what they even believe in. There is nothing. And compare that with the hundreds of pages that were written about Islamic extremism, the distorted way that it was presented to the government. There is no story of far-right extremism in the counterterrorism strategy. The label of terrorism in the United Kingdom is a label that has been constructed to mean a very specific thing, and it's terrorism as a foreign problem, as a problem of a particular community, rather than being a societal problem with many different facets. So what we have is, well, we have many things. I've spoken about how the counterterrorism strategy acts as a way of border control, but also the current national security strategy that we have in place is not fit for purpose because it cannot recognize the threat from the far right. It's not even that it refuses to recognize it or that it overlooks it, but because of how terrorism has been defined over the years, it doesn't include the threat from the far right. It just doesn't register as terrorism. And that's why we see over and over again multiple acts of violence from the far right happening in the United Kingdom and nobody doing anything about it from the government. They're treating it as isolated cases because for them it is, because that's how they constructed the policy to be like. And that is a problem because research after research has shown that the threat from the far right in the UK is increasing. The latest numbers from the Prevent duty showing, how many people were referred to the Prevent program, which is in itself a problem. But the recent numbers shows that the number of people from the far right being referred now overtakes people from Islamic extremism supposedly being taken into the PREVENT program. The far right is a huge problem in this country, and it's a problem the government is completely inequipped to deal with, and they also have no interest in dealing with it, because in order for them to deal with the threat from the far right, to explain what the far right is, what far right extremism is, what white supremacist violence is, what white nationalist groups are, it would require some kind of national self-awareness and reckoning that this country doesn't have, to see that all of this is rooted in white supremacy, that we live in a white supremacist society that is being reinforced by the policies that we have in place. I'm not holding my breath. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, but it's important that we are aware that this is what needs to happen, because as long as there is this denial that white supremacy is a problem in this country, there will be a refusal for the government to understand what white supremacy is and what white supremacist violence is. Yes, so I wanted to give some examples of how this label of terrorism, the story of terrorism as a foreign problem, has very real-life implications for individuals in the UK. So the first example is the Anti-Terrorism, Crime and Security Act of 2001. This was the UK government's response to 9/11. And the UK was the only country in Europe, in the Council of Europe, that decided that 9/11, an attack in a different country, in a different continent, required a derogation from human rights legislation in the UK. So they required a derogation, meaning that they could breach a particular part of human rights law because of the national security threat. That was Article 5, which I might be mistaken, but the right to liberty. So the Anti-Terrorism, Crime and Security Act led the indefinite detention of foreign terrorist suspects, and later this was challenged in the Supreme Court, and it became known as the Belmarsh case. The individuals that were terrorist suspects, and I always emphasize this, they were suspects, they weren't charged with anything or convicted with anything, and they were foreign individuals, and they couldn't be deported for whatever reason at the time, so the solution from the government was to indefinitely detain them. The House of Lords at the time, which we didn't have a Supreme Court then, it was the House of Lords, they declared that this was a disproportionate breach of human rights for many reasons, but one of them was discrimination, because what about domestic terrorism? They couldn't be indefinitely detained. Why is this only a power that's being applicable to foreigners? And the government couldn't reply to that. And of course it's a power that was only applicable to foreigners because that's the only people the government see as potential terrorists and threats. Another example is more recent. Temporary exclusion orders that came to power in the Terrorism and Security Act 2015. So temporary exclusion orders are orders that the Home Secretary can declare against an individual who's outside of the UK and remove, it basically cancels their passport for 2 years. So they're not allowed back in the country. It's a modern form of exile. And it's quite serious. Imagine being exiled away from your family, from your support network. But also, if you're exiled, the way that the world has been the way that the world has been socially constructed by individuals is that we depend on states for our rights. And if you don't have a state, if you don't have access to that state, you are vulnerable. You don't have access to your rights. And this is a power that is only, in practice, applicable to individuals in the UK who have a history of immigration, because they're the ones that are more likely to go abroad to fight for a cause or whatever reason. So it is very unlikely that a white supremacist is going to go abroad to fight somewhere, because we don't have those kinds of conflicts. White supremacy is different. But it is very likely that somebody as an Islamic extremist will leave the country to do that, more likely than a white supremacist. And this kind of punishment, this form of exile, is a very serious, presents a serious breach of human rights, which is not applicable to British white citizens who could have committed crimes. So again, that is a difference in rights. And the one that I think is the most insidious of all is the deprivation of citizenship powers. We don't have the death penalty in this country, thankfully. So I believe that the harshest punishment the state can unleash on an individual is to remove them their citizenship, to strip them of their nationality. Because as I said before, in the world that we live in, you need to have a state in order to access your rights. If you don't have a state, you don't have a way to access your rights. You are stateless. So much so that making somebody stateless is a breach of the Geneva Convention. It is a breach of human rights. You're not allowed to do that. But the government does, over and over again. And the reason that they have done it, the way that they've circumvented this, is that they've said that it is not, pretend that I'm the government, it's not my job to ensure that you have a citizenship somewhere. It is your job. So what they've done over and over again with individuals in this case, they have stripped them of their nationality because they have immigrant connections of some kind. They could have been born in this country, but their parents or grandparents were born somewhere else. So they might not have, let's say, Iraqi citizenship at the time. This was the case of Al-Jeddah that went through the Supreme Court. He didn't have Iraqi citizenship at the time, but the government stripped him of his British nationality, and he sued the government saying, you're making me stateless. But the government came out and said, no, we're not making you stateless. You're making yourself stateless because you could apply for Iraqi citizenship. You haven't done it, so it's your fault. So it is this national gaslighting, but also is a serious breach of somebody's human rights, but it's a punishment that is only applicable to those of us who are British citizens. I count myself in this group, who are British citizens who have a history of immigration. White supremacists are not likely to have a history of immigration. This is not a punishment that is available to white supremacists. And what gets me the most about this is that deprivations of citizenships tend to happen before somebody has even been charged with a crime, just suspect, or because the government doesn't like them, as we can see in the case of Shamima Begum. The government doesn't like her. Sajid Javid, when he was Home Secretary, oh, you can't see it. Where did it go? There you go. Sajid Javid, when he was Home Secretary, he said, there is no place in this country for somebody who hates the UK. She doesn't hate the UK. She never says that she has. She was groomed at 15 to leave to Syria. She has been in a refugee camp for many years. She has lost 3 children. She has gone through untold and unaccountable trauma. And she has yet to be charged with any crimes. That's the thing that gets to me. If the government really thinks that she has done something wrong, then charge her with a crime. Bring her back to the country, put her through trials. And if she is to be arrested and charged with a crime and she's found guilty, so be it. That's what we have a justice system for, which is, we have a very problematic justice system, but that's a point for another day. But if somebody is a threat to the country, you charge them with a crime. They have deemed her to be a threat, when as far as we know, she hasn't committed any crimes. She hasn't been charged with any crimes. But you know who has been charged with crimes? His name is Ben John. He's 21 years old. You might know him, might not know his name, but you might know him from the news because he was the white supremacist that was convicted, but he wasn't sent to jail. Instead, the judge told him to read Jane Austen novels and Charles Dickens because he was described as an innocent teenager. He was 21, an innocent teenager who was angry and confused and lonely. And he was given the benefit of the doubt. He was found to have downloaded bomb-making manuals, links to neo-Nazi imagery. He had participated in neo-Nazi forums. He had written about killing immigrants. But the judge thought that he didn't mean it. Literally, that's what it said. He didn't mean it. He was just lonely and confused. And read some Jane Austen. That will make him feel better. People thought that case was on the news quite a lot because it is quite bizarre, but it's not an anomaly. This is Ryan Mcgee. A few years ago, I think it's 2015, but I may be wrong because I'm very bad with dates. He was found with the largest cache of weapons in the United Kingdom at the time. He was found with explosives and bomb-making equipment. He was found with serious, graphic, violent white supremacist videos. He had written in his diary that he vowed to bring every last immigrant to hell. He was not charged with terrorist offenses because the Crown Prosecution Service said that he didn't mean it. He wrote it in his diary that he was going to do it. He got the bomb-making equipment. He had the largest cache of weapons in this country in the last few years in his room, but they thought, he didn't mean it. He was just angry and confused and lonely. So instead of being charged with terrorist offenses, he was charged with under the Dangerous Explosive Act, which means that he served, I think it was 2 years, which means that he's now free. As is Ben John, because he wasn't arrested. He needs to read Jane Austen and then come back in a couple of years in a suspended sentence and speak to the judge about Jane Austen, because that's justice. And this is Jake Davidson, the Plymouth shooter. So a lot of my work in the last few years, quite recently really, has been looking at incel, the incel community, the interlinks between the incel community and white supremacists, and the proposition that extreme misogyny should be considered an extremist ideology akin to far-right extremism, Islamic extremism, etc. I wrote an article in The Independent quite recently arguing for this, because the counterterrorism unit came out saying that no, it wasn't extremism, he was just a lonely man, he was angry, and he was engaged in some kind of thinking. Every ideology is some kind of thinking. So he said that the counterterrorism guy, who's this very senior officer, came out and said it wasn't an ideology, it was some kind of thinking. What's the difference? Every ideology is some kind of thinking. Everything is some kind of thinking. I'm engaged in some kind of thinking right now. What does that mean? It doesn't mean anything. It's again an example of somebody, a white man, committing an act of violence. In this case, he killed people with a very clear trail of extreme misogyny and white supremacy, but not being considered an act of terror, not even the threat not being taken seriously. And the threat cannot be taken seriously because that's not what the story of terror that we have been told for the last 20 years is. So it happens over and over again. Again, these are 3 cases, but they're just 3 cases out of dozens, out of hundreds even. This happens all the time. Just in 2019, there were 2 teenagers, they were 19 at the time, they were found in London with bombs and bomb-making equipment, and they had vowed again to drag every immigrant down to hell, because that's what they tend to do. That's what they tend to say. They all say the same thing because they frequent the same forums, which if the government bothered to look at it, he would see this connective tissue, this thread running through all of it. And again, the Crown Prosecution Service, they were actually charged with terrorist offenses and arrested, but you didn't see the government say anything or do anything. And that was in 2019, just 2 out of dozens of terrorist offenses that were committed by the far right on that year. It happens all the time, but we are missing it. And by we, I mean the government, not us, because most people are aware of this. Unless you're white, then you tend not to be aware of it. So this is an example of a quote that I think really summarizes what I've been trying to say. It's from Laura Bates, and she wrote a book called Men Who Hate Women about the incel community and extreme misogyny, and that quote is from her book. She says, "What if we can't begin to take a comprehensive and effective approach to policing acts of violence because we don't describe them in the ways that acknowledge the connections between them? What if our ideas about men and women, about misogyny and hate crime, about what terrorists look like, are so trapped in stereotypes that we are making terrible mistakes?" And the British government is making a terrible mistake in the way that they approach counterterrorism for 2 reasons. Firstly, because you cannot have nation building out of security and security policy, because what that does is creates boundaries between people rather than unite them. So that is a failed experiment, and we can see that all over us. We see all the division that's present in the United Kingdom right now. That is not a coincidence. It hasn't come from nowhere. It is decades in the making of policy after policy that is acting as a way of border control. And a lot of people have done research on this. And my area of looking at border control is counterterrorism as border control. Ooh, there's lots of typos on that page. Let's pretend that they're not there. So let's tell you a story about the fact that there are no typos on that slide. So like I was saying, the current story, the last 2 decades of counterterrorism, is damaging community relationships in the UK. It is damaging any kind of idea of nation building that can be built with uniting people rather than dividing them. The policy itself is white supremacy. It's an example of white supremacist policy. But what I find really crucial in this as well is that the problems are twofold. Obviously, we have a failure of nation building because we're creating more divisions rather than bringing people together. But at the very basics of a national security policy, this is not making us any safer, because it is not only overlooking a serious and growing threat, but because of the discriminatory way that it has been constructed over the years, it is fueling the division that extremists themselves exploit. So it is really failing in every possible way, but yet it's still in place. But this is also not unique. This happens in the United States too. So there is a journalist, his name is Spencer Ackermann. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. He wrote a book called Reign of Terror about the last 20 years of the UK, of the American counterterrorism strategy. I'm currently writing a book on the last 20 years of the UK counterterrorism strategy. But Spencer and I spoke again on my podcast, Enemies of the People. about his book. And he talks about how the same problems that we're having here in the UK are in the United States. The counterterrorism strategy in the United States, the war on terror, is rooted in white supremacy and has been delivered in a way that overlooks the real threat from white nationalist groups. I spoke also for the podcast with a scholar in the United States called Sarah Kamali, and she wrote a book called Homegrown Hate about white nationalists and Islamic extremists in the US. And she talks about how both groups, white nationalists and Islamic extremists, exploit the divisions created by the war on terror to recruit for their causes. And it's the same here as well. So this is a global problem. It's not only a problem in the United Kingdom. So where do we go next? I always find this part hard because I spend all this time telling people how horrible things are, and then they look at me like, okay, so how do we fix it? And like, I don't know. And it's on many ways, it's not my job to know because I'm not in the government. I'm not a policymaker. I'm a researcher. I research these issues, I expose them, and then the people who are in charge of making decisions should take this knowledge and do something about it. But I also take a lot of comfort from the fact that this is all a social construction, that this is a story that has been told. It has been told over and over again. It's a very successful story, but it can be untold. It was created by individuals and it can be unmade by individuals. And it's not going to happen because suddenly this government is going to have a crisis of consciousness and be like, oh my God, we are white supremacists and we have been white supremacists for generations. How do we fix it? That's not going to happen. It's going to happen from the grassroots. It's going to happen from the bottom. So every opportunity to talk about these things, like I've had here today, and that's why I'm very grateful for it, to expose these issues, to bring them to light, any opportunity to heal divisions, to try to reach a hand across the aisle and to understand each other is an opportunity to fix things. But I also have to say this with a caveat, because when I talk about reaching across the aisle and trying to convince people, I don't mean speaking with white supremacists and far-right extremists, because there's no convincing them and you'll be putting myself in danger. I think there is a line that has to be drawn where we don't engage with people who don't believe in somebody else's humanity. There is a tendency in the media these days, especially on the BBC, but in the mainstream media in general, to both sides the argument. You know, we have to appear neutral and balanced by having two sides of the argument, but there are no two sides, or there should be no two sides when it comes to somebody's human rights and when it comes to somebody's dignity as a human being. So when I talk about reaching across the aisle and trying to heal divisions, that is also part of it, is refusing to engage in this both-sidism that we have nowadays, because there is, for me anyway, no debating with somebody that denies somebody's humanity because of some kind of arbitrary value. Because my work has always been deeply grounded in the concept of human rights, in the concept that we are all individuals, regardless of where we come from, regardless of what we believe in. We are all individuals working together and living together in this world and telling each other stories. And any kind of story that violates somebody else's humanity is a step too far. So when I talk about reaching across the aisle, there are also limits to that, because there is nothing to be gained by debating with somebody who doesn't believe in somebody else's humanity. However, those people, thankfully, are in the minority. They're a very powerful minority, but they are in the minority. So there is a lot of room for conversation and a lot of room for agreement and a lot of room to explore these issues. These are complicated issues. Not everybody will agree with me. Not everybody has to agree with me. We just have to agree on the basics that we all have human rights that have value. Everything else can be worked on. But I think what is missing from society, from the media, and from this government is this willingness to listen to feedback, to hear about the ways that we could have hurt people and how can we fix it. There is this defensiveness, which a lot of researchers have written about in the concept of white fragility. There is this defensiveness when it comes to talking in the UK about issues of race, issues of immigration, and issues of white supremacy. And that is a problem, but I think it's a problem that needs to be challenged. And that's why people tell me, whenever I talk about us living in a white supremacist country, they're like, oh, but Maria, it's not the Klan, it's not the KKK, they're not wearing white hoods in parliament. I was like, well, they don't have to, because the KKK in many ways is a caricature of white supremacy. White supremacy is not a group, it's a system of organizing society which values some lives over the others. And that is the society that we're embedded in, and we all have a role to play in ending it. It's not our job to fix it, but we are able to challenge it. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, that we are not here to fix the problem that somebody else created. We're here to challenge the situation and to do what we can to bring people together in the grassroots, to tell each other our stories, to listen to each other's stories, and to try to create a better society. Because the big society didn't work, but hopefully a society of stories and a society of storytellers will be what fixes things. So thank you. And that's me. You can find me on Twitter. I spend too much time there at Maria W. Norris. That is my podcast, Enemies of the People. We have 10 episodes so far, and I think they're very fascinating. It's a podcast about extremism and fascism in the 21st century, so we deal with all of the issues that we're talking about here with experts, policymakers, etc. So yes, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and thank you for listening.
We have a short period of time for Q&A, so for about 2 or 3 questions, and then if you have questions afterwards, maybe you can ask Maria directly, but just 2 or 3, if that's okay?
Hi Maria, thanks very much. That was a really interesting talk.
Thank you.
My question is, can you think of any examples of countries that have a much more balanced and effective policy?
Mm-hmm. New Zealand, not Australia. Australia is very bad, but New Zealand has a very good policy, especially after the Christchurch shooting that happened a few years ago. New Zealand was very clear and automatically and openly saying that is an act of terror. We need to deal with this way. And they have since then launched a lot of education policies and counter-extremism work to do with the far right. They're not perfect, but they're doing a good job. They're doing better than we are. Canada is also interesting because Canada has a lot of problems, but in many ways, their counterterrorism strategy is just as Islamophobic as the US and the UK, but Canada has recently taken a few steps towards accepting incel extremism and extreme misogyny as an extremist ideology that also leads to terror, which is something that the UK is not doing. The UK has openly said that that's not what they're concerned with. So I think Canada is an interesting country to look at for developments on this, but New Zealand, out of all the countries, is the one that's doing the best, I think.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking. It was really interesting. I can't wait to check out your podcast.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask about, I've heard that cucumber story a couple of times before, years ago, and I just wanted, over the years of being challenged and the government being, under scrutiny, and so have you seen much change? Less funding or, practice in schools?
Yes, no. They've doubled down on it. So they are really seeing that is their flagship policy. So we don't have as many extreme examples as cucumber over the years, but we have, kids who were saying that at their house they don't celebrate Christmas, being referred to the counterterrorism program. Or there was a child who sang a song, an Islamic song, and the teacher got freaked out and referred them to the counterterrorism program. So no, but what is an interesting development is that there was a report released a couple of weeks ago. There was researchers at UCL did some research with teachers, and the teachers were saying that what they're seeing more and more in the classroom is students espousing far-right views, is students talking conspiracy theories about the vaccine or Bill Gates or, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. The teachers are seeing this in the classroom, and they're telling the government, we can't deal with it. We don't know how to deal with it. This is not the training we were given. We need help. And so far, the government is not doing anything about it because they don't get it. Yeah.
Are those where far-right extremism is popping up in schools,
Yeah.
Are they happening in the same kind of, I don't know if you know this, but in the same local authorities that are being funded for
Yeah.
counter? Are they happening the same, or are they being targeted, or?
Yeah, so I think the funding is very obscure at the moment. I'm not clear where the funding is going to because they're not releasing that data, and because since prevent has become a statutory duty, that is on all local authorities. This is all a local authority's job to do this. It's no longer individual local authorities, it's a national issue. So it is quite problematic, especially because there's no transparency of where the funding is, but also what is happening to these referrals, right? What are this training that the teachers are receiving? I found a few training manuals, and they're horrible, but they're not available. You need to ask for them. I mean, my husband is a solicitor, and when he used to work in London before we moved to the Midlands, he went through a counterterrorism, like an extremism training in his course, in his job, and he was like, if a colleague starts wearing Islamic clothes, or they start going to prayer at lunchtime, that kind of thing, which is extremely discriminatory and Islamophobic. and bad. This is not going to tell you if somebody is a threat when it comes to extremism. Researchers have done a lot of work in spotting signs, early signs that somebody could be going down the road of extremism, be it extreme misogyny, being white supremacist, be Islamic extremism, but that's not the message that the government is giving in this training. But also this training is not centralized, so there isn't a centralized unit in the government that comes with these trainings. It's all very unclear and very, very secretive, which is a big part of the problem.
Last question.
Thank you very much for your discourse. I agree with you that the solution lies in changing the narrative. I don't know if you have reflected on whether the Black Lives Matter issue will help in changing this narrative in the UK.
I think it will. I think the prominence that Black Lives Matter has had globally, rather than just being isolated in the United States, has really been quite helpful in exposing all of these things, because these things are not in a vacuum, right? This is all connected. This is about socioeconomic inequality. This is about racism. This is about all of these things embedded with each other. So I think when light is shone in one area, it can shine everywhere. So there is also quite interesting, I keep on referring to my podcast, and yes, I want people to listen to it, but also one of the people I spoke with for the podcast is a writer called Alex von Telzelman, and she wrote a book called Fallen Idols about all the furor over statues and how governments protect statues more than they protect individuals. And she talks in a very detailed way about the Black Lives Matter movement in the US and how it's come here to the UK and how people have congregated on this idea of statues as a way to highlight systemic and historical inequalities in the country. So I think that is a very, very good way. And I'm reminded finally, my daughter, she's named Grace Maria. And I named her Grace because it's a beautiful name, but I also, is a poem that I read many years ago about the physics of grace, how one drop of light can end an age of darkness. So I think that any light that is shone on these issues, be it through Black Lives Matter, be it through conversations like this, be it through my podcast or whatever, you can have these kind of conversations. These are definitely steps forward because it is a small light that can help end the darkness.
Sorry. Thank you very much. I think we're going to end there. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just a couple of quick announcements. If you would like to be optionally COVID tested, there is a program out here on behalf of the Salam Pharmacy, so you can get tested if you'd like to. No compulsion, obviously. Next week we have the death anniversary of Imam Hassan al-Askari, and Sheikh Hassan Rushandal will be speaking. The week after we have Shaheen Mohiddin, who will be speaking about Islamophobia as racism, looking at India. And the week after, on the Saturday, we have Milad al-Nabi program, Khayal Theatre coming to present on that day. And the week after, on Friday, we have Tosif Khan, who will be speaking about his latest book. So hopefully you'll be able to join us on some of these sessions coming up. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. And if you have any questions directly and you want to speak to Maria, she's around over there for a few minutes afterwards. Thank you.